Good morning and happy Saturday. Welcome to Inside Texas Football, powered by InsideTexas.com. I'm here with Evan, and as you can tell, basically from our hair, we're well prepared for today. Evan put out an article earlier this week comparing the skill players that the University of Texas is bringing back with the quote contenders. I mean, I think it's fair to say, Evan, that covering this, you've got about I think four of the other major contenders, which are teams that, and in no way being reductive to you, but the average fan would probably assume are contenders, right? It's not. We don't need to go in depth to know how deep these rosters are. So, what I'd love to do is just kind of go through a little bit, maybe of your methodology and how you kind of came to this conclusion. So, first off, you started this by specifically looking at the offensive line, which gave you an opportunity then to expand. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what you learned and how you went about this process.
Yeah, I think this all started when our own Eric Nolan was doing his kind of degree audit. I'm talking about my own audits,
Right,
audits
yeah.
of the roster and talking about the offensive line, and that was one that garnered a lot of attention on our boards. A lot of people obviously are they have their own opinions about like players like Neto Meazulu, Brandon Baker, Trevor Gooseby are going to have to start this year. And so I saw a lot of things that were kind of saying like this is not an offensive line that's going to be ready to play at the top of their game, at the top of this level of play. And I was kind of thinking that's might be a little bit BS, just thinking about how the college football world works. It seems like around this time every year with every team that teams are doing this. I went on the Georgia boards. I saw people going, this offensive line is in a terrible spot, even though they probably are going to have a better offensive line than Texas is this year. So my
Sure.
idea was I wanted to find a way to kind of quantify how good an offensive line can be. And that's hard to do. There's no easy way to quantify and put a number on an offensive line skill. So I wanted to get three main categories down. And that's something you see in the article. It's returning production, which is what I use PFF grade for. Not perfect. PFF is far from a perfect site, but probably the best thing we have right now to find
Right.
a specific number for how good an offensive lineman is. Talent, which I use recruiting/transfer rating. It's not fair to say a guy's not talented if he was a 92 graded transfer, even if he was an 80 graded recruit 4 years ago, and vice versa. If someone was a 96 rated recruit but hasn't been good at all, he should be dumbed down a little bit. And then also snaps, the amount of games you've played, your experience in the NCAA leagues. That's just an important piece of all of this. You need someone who's played a lot of ball. So I wanted to kind of all put that together and find a way to make it seem, as you can see this chart right here, to find a number to put on how good our offensive line will be.
And so basically the way that you broke this down is obviously those three categories, right? So we have career snaps, recruiting or transfer rating, and again, the PFF grade, which is exactly what you just outlined. Looking at the ceiling here, obviously 2,000 plus snaps, a recruiting level that high, and a PFF grade that high. That kid's not in college anymore.
Yeah.
that kid's making their way to the league. So, really, when you were going through this, what ended up being the ceiling that you saw was really the kind of the goal that a player should be reaching for?
So I think I found it in this article that Kelvin Banks entering this year is either at 13 out of 15 points or 14 out of 15. I forgot the exact number off the top of my head, but he had that really good recruiting transfer rating, and even I think his was past the 96, so it was like a 97.5.
Right.
He had that really elite PFF grade. He just didn't have 2,000 career snaps, which he was entering his third year in college. That's completely fine. I
Right. But
believe
again, a third year as a starter. So this should
exactly.
just tell you how difficult it is to get to the 2000. I mean, and even Texas played 30 games last year. So, or in the
Yeah.
last 2 years. So to get to 2,000 plus snaps, that's a ton of snaps.
And both Banks and Majors will be guys that would have been right there in that number. So they weren't even hitting that. Majors did hit it entering this year because it was his fourth year in college. But that's just to say, like, if you're going to be that well recruited and you're going to be playing that much since the start of your time and you were an 80 plus graded player, you're not staying in college. So I think
Right.
14 is probably the highest number you're going to see of any player. And when we get to the skill position players, we'll talk about a very controversial 14 grade that was given.
So let's just go ahead and get into these skill players. So before we do, let's look at the teams that we talked about here. Okay, so for those of you that we talked again about that upper echelon of teams we would certainly expect to be in the college football playoff this next year, and that is Ohio State, Georgia, Texas, Oregon, and Penn State. So the reason I'm outlining this up front is I want you to know kind of the the metric or the pool rather that we're swimming in when we're looking at these skilled players and how we go about evaluating them. I say we as if I did any work whatsoever. This is all Evan doing all this work. So let's go ahead and look at the skill positions, and go ahead, Evan, and let us know, like, obviously we've got our quarterback, our running back, our wide receiver, tight end, and then how did you evaluate that flex position?
Yeah, so my eyes, you have every team has to have these five positions: the QB1, the RB1, the tight end one, two outside receivers, or in DeAndre Moore's case, he plays more of that slot role. But then I was looking at all five of these teams, which I came up with. Not really, I came up with just looked at betting odds. Honestly, I'm not a betting man, but they give a good idea of what the consensus is of these teams. And far and away, these were the top five teams in pretty much every site. And so I looked at these teams this last year and what were their offensive skill position players like? Who was getting the extra snaps? For Texas, there was always going to be around 5 to 6 guys that were always getting important playing time. If it wasn't Wisner at running back, it was Jaden Blue, who would have been in that flex spot. Ryan Wingo would have been in that flex spot last year with Isaiah Bond and Matthew Golden and DeAndre Moore. So that's why I was just saying, like, obviously you can't have this many players on the field at a time, but Quintrayvon Wisner is going to play a ton, and he shouldn't be left off of this chart just because he's also a running back compared to Baxter. Whereas teams like Georgia, in my calculations, had 2 tight ends, which Texas doesn't have, but that's just Georgia's play style. So
Right.
Wisner and Parker Livingston are that idea of if there's a third receiver on the field, that's the flex. If there's a second running back on the field or a change in running back instead of Baxter, what I assume enters the year as the starter. That's not completely confirmed, but I had Wisner as the flex. You could change either one of those.
And it should come as no shock to anyone who has been following this team that when we're talking returning starters, this is, as you've pointed out in this third column here, that is an incredibly young batch of talent here. I mean, we've got obviously Wisner is coming in as a junior, DeAndre is coming in as a junior, but the majority of this base of skilled talent is sophomores and freshmen. So how does it, you rated the experience, which was done by snap count, but how did that factor in as well? Because certainly you have a snap count as an experience, but it's also years in the program, right? So redshirt freshman, maybe being acquainted with the offense and the culture of the program. How much did that factor into the way you thought about this?
So honestly, that was something I didn't factor in when I did the offensive line article part of this, and I got some not maybe pushback, but just some feedback saying this is an important part of this. You know, a player that has only had, let's say, 260 career snaps in Arch Manning's case, but he'll have been in Austin for 3 off seasons. That's a pretty important piece of his information and pretty important for when you're evaluating who that player is. So in this scenario, I didn't have it as much weight into the factor of there's a point system that I'm anointing each player for the amount of years in the program. But as you can see when you scroll farther down, there is a final kind of number next to that total of the average years in the program these players are playing. Ohio State, I believe, was the team that had the least amount of continuity over time. They brought in a lot of transfers. I believe they had 2 transfers, if I'm right. Yes, 2 transfers. They have a second-year quarterback. They have a second-year running back. So they don't have a lot going on in this program's time. While as Penn State, who we're going to talk about, I assume at some point, their guys are having 3 years in this program minimum, and that's with 2 transfer receivers. So there's a lot that comes into play with just being in the program.
And in your opinion, when you are evaluating this, I think it's fair to say, and I think the criticism that evaluating in program talent, that is to say how long they've been in the program, is of value. But these teams aren't taking schlubs when they transfer in. You know, the players that are coming in more than likely are going to be starters at worst number 2 in the depth chart, right? So it is a very difficult thing to evaluate because you are bringing in players of a high caliber to these types of teams. So even if you're looking at this and say like, well, look, Ohio State has a ton of transfers, right? Well, those transfers are probably very good football players. And because they're very good football players, they're able to acclimate to these systems pretty quickly. Well, let's talk about the teams then. Unless you want to go into the specific players that Texas has to give us an idea of where our starting point is. What would be best for you?
Yeah, sure. So I think we can just go a little bit into like who the highest rated guys on Texas are. And I don't think they're going to come to much surprise. Arch Manning, even with that in that red territory for the career snaps, he was nearly a perfect recruit. And when he did play, I made the PFF grade a minimum of 200 snaps just because you're playing 100 snaps, you're just not getting an accurate enough grade. And that's the case for Baxter, Washington, Livingston. But PFF loved him. They thought he was one of the best quarterbacks in America. Our fans thought he was one of the best quarterbacks in America. And I think that's fair. I don't think you can put him past this 11 grade, but he was elite when he was on the field. He was an elite recruit. Basically, you just need to see what's going to happen. And then in the case of someone like Baxter, he didn't play last year. I gave any player that didn't play enough snaps just 2 points in theory, 2 out of 5. Just say that you weren't terrible, but you also didn't play. So we can't put you there. But Baxter's got the talent. Wingo is one of the best graded players here. Great recruit. Played a lot last year. Didn't play amazingly, I would say, throughout the season, but you expect that sophomore year jump in any player of Wingo's talent. And then Moore and Wisner, who are the veterans in this group, were solid players. They still have solid grades. And obviously the kind of the big red flags and the marked red are Washington, Livingston coming in with little snaps played, not elite recruits in this last class 2 years ago, but still, talented players that deserve playing time.
Can we talk a little bit about Livingston for the casual fan? And I don't mean that as a pejorative, but look, most fans just watch the games and aren't here. But if you are here now, you're clearly a lot deeper into this than the average fan. But let's talk a little bit about Parker Livingston, because as you pointed out, our very own Eric Nalin is very bullish on him. He thinks he is going to be certainly in that starter position or absolutely in the 2D. Where did he factor into all of this as someone that the fans may not know much about because he didn't see much playing time?
Yeah, I mean, as Xavier in our chat has pointed out, this is a player with insane size. He is 6'4" already, and he has been reported to be one of the fastest players on the team. He was running out there with players like Jaden Blue, with players like Ryan Niblett in their dashes out in practice. And it seems like someone that, if the games had to be played tomorrow, he would be that third receiver on the roster. He would be playing outside as kind of that X receiver. He's going to be able to stretch the field no matter what. I don't think that's going to be a question. I think teams will have to recognize that this guy can go over the top and be a person that Arch Manning loves to throw deep to, while Wingo can work in the intermediate, while Moore can work in the underneath. I think the problem will be with Livingston. Can he win those outside one-on-ones to get a 3rd and 7, which Texas struggled with last year? They got to do a lot of 3rd and longs. And is this someone polished enough to play a full season and have true consistent production? I think I also noted in this chart that someone like Khalil Lockett, who was entering his first year in the program, would have graded higher just because he would have had a higher transfer rating, a recruiting rating. So I think he would have been like 1 or 2 points higher. I don't think it would have made that much of a difference, but I think Lockett and Livingston are both going to play a good bit this year if there's no transfer wide receiver. So that could have been Khalil Lockett if you wanted to. They're both that kind of player of the go up and get me the ball, I'll bring it down for you. And I think that's going to be a really fun element that Texas is losing with Matthew Golden, but gaining with his youngsters.
It should also be noted, and you point this out very clearly in the article, the premise of this is not to establish a ceiling, but a floor going into the season. There are so many factors that go into this. And in fact, Texas is very likely going to be pretty aggressive, as it was last year in the spring transfer portal. So some of this may change, and even these players that are on this list may change. And I want to talk about that. But before we do, let's hear from our sponsor for today.
I'm just going to say, guys, you probably need a fiduciary financial advisor. And I've got the guy for you. His name is David McClellan with Forum Financial. He works broadly and deeply with his clients as a financial life coach. And he should know something about coaching because he won several national championships as a swimmer for the University of Texas. He specializes in financial planning and has contributed numerous articles to Kiplinger on the topic of retirement tax bombs. So contact David today to be your fiduciary financial planner and schedule a 1-hour consultation to assess your financial situations. The free consultation is available, so just give him a call. The number is 312-933-8823. That's 312-933-8823. His email is also in the description below.
How is your fiduciary financial planning going, Evan? Entering your final, couldn't tell you. Okay, great. Yeah, it's that last semester of college, I think, is where it slaps you across the face.
I work on ramen noodles, so.
No, I understand. We've got, as we pointed out, look, this is the floor that we're looking at, right? A lot of things can change, certainly in the spring. Last year, we brought in some depth and some contributors, frankly, on the defensive line. I understand that we're talking about skill positions here, but let's not discount the fact that Arch Manning is going to be very appealing to any wide receiver that is considering transferring. So Texas may very likely have their pick of the litter like they did a couple years ago with Isaiah Bond. So that is a factor I think that should be considered when we're looking at this. But let's move on a little bit and talk about now the relationship that this evaluation of our skill talent has with the rest of the contenders. So let's break this down, if that's all right with you. We're going to go down here and look a little bit about this chart and tell us a little bit about how you came to this and what some of your conclusions were.
Yeah, so I wanted to find as easy and as simple of a readable way to show how these other teams are doing it, while also kind of putting the proof of the pudding of how I'm ranking these players. So you can see where Ohio State's quarterback is, where Oregon's running back is, Texas at tight end, all these spots. And I wanted to highlight some of like the most prominent players. So obviously Ohio State's 13 wide receivers, Jeremiah Smith. That's a guy who's entering his sophomore year, and he's already got that 13 rating. In the ways that we were talking about, if he ever gets to 2,000 snaps in college football, it's because Ryan Day gave him $40 million of his own money to stay in Columbus. Exactly. He'll never hit that 15 number, but he'll probably be the 14 number by the time we get next year. But you can also see that they have a really, really elite group of the three next guys. Carnell Tate was really strong for them in that playoff run. C.J. Donaldson is a running back who came from our new running back coaches, West Virginia. C.J. Donaldson is going to be kind of a power guy. James Peoples, who's that second flex, is going to be their more boom or bust player who could have that sophomore year breakout that you're looking for. And then Max Clare, a tight end who I thought Texas would make a bigger run for, but obviously it's hard to offsell the Ohio State National Championship. They're a great team. They have a great grade, but that 2-year in the program average is a pretty obvious one to point out. Is there's a lot that could go wrong, and that's definitely your ceiling versus floor idea. The floor looks good, but there could be some bust potential with that, especially with Julian Sand entering his first year as a starter. Another really important player to point out is Mekhi Hughes at running back for Oregon. I think he could be one of the best running backs in the nation. He was dominant at Tulane, and this is a wide open backfield for him. He has every carry he would want. The big problem with Oregon is saying, who's that wide receiver to? And is Dante Moore really the real deal here? Evan Stewart's going to be good. I think the tight end position is going to be loaded, but can Moore really distribute the way that Dylan Gabriel was? That's kind of the big question for me.
It's also worth noting that national championship team, the big cost for them was retention, right? So that was an experienced team coming in with a lot of snaps in the program, which is going to invariably change. And it's also that factor that we pointed out earlier is really hard to quantify when evaluating the skill talent like that. So that's Ohio State. Let's talk a little bit about the other SEC team that's on this list, and that's, of course, Georgia.
Yeah, I think what you see with Georgia is the floor of the floor. You're not seeing any star players on this offense, but they did a really, really good job of using the portal to just get guys in. Nate Frazier is going to be their expected running back this year with ETN going to the draft. He's someone that they love. He's their version of CJ Baxter entering the year. And then they have Zach Branch coming in, Noah Thomas. They've got a lot of tight end talent with Delp. They just have a lot of guys who are going to be baseline good and experienced. And I don't think they're going to have any players that are true difference makers the way Brock Bowers was in that program at times. But what really struggled last year was Carson Beck just had so many drops going against his way. The receivers were not just not playing that great, they were bad at times. And you're returning that tight end production. The running game is in theory going to be a bit more consistent without ETN's injuries. So all Gunnar Stockton has to do is play that zone read style that he did against Texas, which succeeded for Georgia, and find playmakers like Noah Thomas who can go up and get a ball, Zach Branch who you want to get out in space, finding easy ways to make this guy's life easier in his first year starting.
We are in a constant battle, it seems. And I think some of this is probably just because of the media of it, and we are part of that. But I do think that Oregon is a team that everybody's looking to, certainly because of the mythos of Phil Knight and his supposed desire to get a national championship before he dies. So they are, if you've been following recruiting the last few years, absolutely stacked. How do they rank in this metric that you've established?
Yeah, it's honestly not great. You can see Texas is the fifth place team in this, which might surprise some people. Honestly, does not surprise me, given the lack of portal acquisition. I didn't have my individual Google sheets that I had written down, but all these other teams are bringing a lot more transfers to their positions. Oregon being one of them. I believe they had 2 on their offense, but yeah, they're going to rely a lot on Hughes. They're going to rely a lot on Everett Stewart, but I'm definitely concerned about their floor with Dante Moore at quarterback. He was playing on a bad UCLA team as a freshman, and he was a true freshman, but he didn't look great. He didn't really live up to that 96 recruiting rating he had. And I ended up using his transfer portal rating, which was a lot closer to an average quarterback, a lot closer to Stockton. And that's why he's the lowest grade quarterback. I think that helps their ceiling, that this is a guy who was a former top 5 recruit in the same class Manning was in. It helps that they have Evan Stewart returning, who's a great college football receiver. But I don't think they have the depth at receiver to really make a huge difference the way they did these last 2 years when they were sending 2 different guys to the draft. Stewart probably could have been a 3rd-round pick in the NFL this year if he wanted to. Came back to school. But this is a team that is going to have a lot of really good offensive linemen. I think they're going to have some dominant defensive players. But I'm a little concerned about, hey, who else is going to catch the ball? Is Dante Moore going to be able to get into these pockets that Dylan Gabriel was elite at, but he was playing in a 6th year in college? So there's just a lot of different things going on in Oregon this year.
Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you're watching this on YouTube, it really does help us out. Like and subscribe. If you guys are over at Twitter, thank you so much for joining this. Go ahead and follow the person whose account you're watching this on. We talked a little bit. Okay, so Oregon, maybe not the best quarterback that you've seen, but if you've been reading anything at InsideTexas.com over the last few years, and please do it, it's only $1 a week. You can join us at InsideTexas.com. Ian Boyd, our very own Ian Boyd, our contrarian Ian Boyd, is very, very clear with his opinion that you do not need an elite quarterback to win a national championship. And if you look at the last few national championships, the teams that have won it haven't necessarily had one, which brings us to Drew Allard and Penn State. Where do they come in all of this? And what do you see them doing next year with their skill talent that's coming back?
Yeah, and you can see that Aller, as I hinted at earlier, got that 14 out of 15, which is pretty much a near perfect rating in this system, which I know I said it already. I spent about 3.5 paragraphs talking about Aller because I've read how our readers talk about him as a quarterback. I'll be frank, he had a bad playoff. He had a bad last 2 games. He looked really bad against Notre Dame, and that's not something that went unnoticed, but still PFF was a big fan of him, maybe a little bit too high on him, but the only guys who were above him in the Big Ten last year were guys like Dylan Gabriel and Will Howard, who are entering their 5th year in college. They were 2019, 2020 recruiting classes. The selling point for me with Alar is that Will Howard just won a national championship. Alar entered the year as a better talent. He's a better arm than Howard ever did. The same build and speed levels that can help you in the zone read game. And he's going to have a better, or not a better supporting cast. He played in a tougher conference. And all that coming with him being just a more experienced player in general. If Will Howard can win a championship and look that good, I don't see why Drew Allard cannot be not a top 5 quarterback in the sport winning the Heisman, which Howard wasn't, but a guy who can lead a top 5 team to win that championship with what's around him. I think most importantly with Penn State is what's around him. They're returning 2 of the top 5 running backs in college football, 2 players that should be playing on Sundays next year, in my opinion. But Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, they wanted to come back, make one more run for it. And then I know I saw Ian on Twitter kind of call out this Devontae Ross acquisition. I think the 12 points may be also a little rich for him. I really struggled with that G4 to Power 5 jump, but Ross has played a ton of college football. He was a really productive slot receiver at Troy. And even if he's not this outside ball winning receiver, he is someone that is going to give you a lot of floor safety because Alar can just dump it off to him. He's a good playmaker in the open field. So he finally has a receiver that's like an actual receiver, which they really struggled with last season. Tyler Warren was awesome, but he was a true inline tight end and is going to be drafted like one. This is someone who not fully on the boundary and on the outside, but someone with some speed, someone with some difference making with his hands that is going to be helpful for Penn State.
We do have a reputation that is totally earned as the University of Texas football fans as either make or break. It's binary. We're the best. We're the worst. This particular breakdown with the metrics that you've established here don't have us looking great in comparison to these other teams going in. But I do want to remind people this is the floor, and this is the presumed floor. There are obviously factors in here, as Evan has pointed out, that are difficult to quantify. Experience in the program being one of them. Going through this process, looking at all these things, if you were to put into summation your conclusion as to where Texas is sitting going into the season, again, prior to the spring transfer portal, what would you say to those very sensitive fans out there?
I think the number one thing is we should be appreciating transfers. If you're a Texas fan, this is not something that Texas should be shying away from. I saw that there was a stat about Texas being a top 5 spender in the portal this last cycle. I can't see that being true. Now they might have be a team that's top 5 in the amount of resources they're going to put into the portal when the spring comes around. But I love the idea of Jordan Washington and Parker Livingston playing a lot. Same with Khalil Lockett. Same with Spencer Shannon getting some blocking reps. But frankly, as someone who's covering this team, I'd like to see them win a national championship. And that's not what you're doing to win the national championship. It's not relying on that many underclassmen, players with very little experience to be not just key contributors, but like true starters, the guys who are playing top 7 snaps on your team. That was led by players like Gunnar Helm and Xavier Matthew Golden last year. That's not going to be what Parker Livingston and Jordan Washington are, even if there is a quick breakout. In this era of college football, you want as many of these upperclassmen, good contributors as possible. So the selling point, I think, is like you said earlier, Arch Manning is who you're throwing you the ball. If you're a wide receiver, I noted Cam Camper, who's a Boise State player later in this article, who a big first down getter. I think it's perfect for Manning. Manning needs a bit of a check down player, in my opinion. Someone on those on those 3rd and 3s where he doesn't have to put his body on the line. He just has someone that's big that can box out a defender, do a nice spacing route, and get you a first down. I think a portal player is important for Texas at one of these receiver positions. That would be number 1 on my board, either tight end or wide receiver. And then once you're there, that rating shoots up a lot. If you just get a player that's, a 9 out of 15 instead of a 6 out of 15, suddenly you're in 2nd or 3rd place on my chart. And I think you have great odds at having a really good attack in the receiving and running game. And then
No, please go ahead.
And I was just going to say another takeaway of this is it truly is a floor exercise. And that's kind of what I learned as I was doing this, because Arch Manning is 3 points behind Drew Allar, but I also think that Arch Manning is the only one of these 5 teams that has a chance of being a Heisman quarterback, a true Heisman winner. And I think he's the only ceiling raising quarterback in this group. Maybe more saying can be that. I don't think this year. I think next year is when you're going to see that. But Stockton, Allar, I don't see it from them. I think Manning can be someone that's going to give you 350 yards in a conference championship game, if those are still around the way that we'd see them at this point next year. And he can truly take over a game by himself. And if that's the case, then players like Baxter, players like Wingo, players like Moore, they're being more supportive. They're not being the carries like someone like Nick Singleton would be or Jeremiah Smith would be. And I think that's an important thing to think about with Texas fans when you're looking at this.
You did first of all, great article, Evan. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you being here. You did the offensive line. You did the offensive skill players. Can we anticipate a similar breakdown on the defense?
Yeah, my goal is to have one about maybe the front 7, maybe just the defensive line. It's kind of tough with defenses because on offense, you have to play this many players outside. Right. But some teams, I would say Texas is more of a 4-2-5 team. You might see a 3-3-5 set up from the team. You might see more base 4-3. Not as common these days, but I'll find a way to split it up into like passing defense / secondary and pass rushers, defensive line, linebackers. But as Xavier pointed out in our chat, like that's going to be one where I'm 100% confident Texas is going to be at the top, even with the implants from the defensive line transfers like Brevard and Shaw. Just returning Colin Simmons and Trey Moore are going to be really important factors. So you can expect to see that. I think that's where you're going to learn a lot about like Penn State in particular. Is this a team for real, or is this they've returned a lot of starters on offense, which I think they returned 7 or 8 offensive starters, a crazy number in this era. But they're trying to do what Ohio State did last year, and you have to credit Franklin for his acquisition of coordinators and players to come back. But expect a defense article and expect that to look good for Texas.
Again, thank you, Evan, and thank you all for being here. Please join us at InsideTexas.com. It is $1 American for each week. Very, 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 very reasonable. And you're going to get articles like this and certainly from our other journalists as we go through this. So again, thank you so much for being here on this Saturday. When Evan finishes that defensive article, we will be sure to have him back. But until then, we will see you for our regularly scheduled program starting on Monday morning. Thanks so much, guys.